Been thinking about McDonald's all day. Can't get it off my mind. I can already taste it. Ooh, got my mind on my mouth and my mouth ready for some Mickey D's deal.
There's a deal for every moment at McDonald's.
Right now, get 2 of your favorites for just $3.50. Mix and match a classic McChicken, a hot and spicy McChicken, or a juicy McDouble. Price and participation may vary. Cannot be combined with combo meal. Single item at regular price.
Wine barrels made from oak are among the oldest technologies used to produce wine. But where all the wood to produce those barrels come from? What oak is good to produce barrels? And what do we do next after this cut? With my guest Mel Knox, international semi-retired wine barrel broker with over 40 years of experience in the barrel trading and educational world, I explored the in and outs of this fascinating part of winemaking. We explored what oak species are used for barrel making and where they're grown, what are the aging styles of the oak, and what are the differences, and how Mel, in his own company, quality controls and certifies his own barrels for cork-ain't. Yes, you heard it right, barrels can give you cork-ain't too. We also talk about Mel's personal interaction with the late Steven Spurrier when Mel was working in the wine shop that supplied the wines for the famous Judgment of Paris. This episode marks the end of the season 1 of the Looking Into Wine podcast. We'll be back in a couple of months with interviews with global experts. Get in touch with us or leave a comment with who or what you would like to learn more about in the wide world of wine, and we will try to integrate into the show. A special thanks to all my listeners. It has been great to have all of you along the way, and to my amazing guests. Now, on with the show. Welcome to Looking Into Wine. I'm Mattia Scarpazza, and today's guest has been working in the wine industry since the mid-70s, where he was working in a wine shop. And while he was working in that wine shop, he also provided the wine for the latest Steven Spurrier wines for the legendary Judgment of Paris. He also, in 2010, received the Merit of Agriculture for the French Republic. Although he says that he is a knight, he doesn't like to be called a sir. And he also been selling wines barrel since the mid-80s, and is here today to talk about the production of wine barrels, some myths, and what is need to be understood and known about wine barrels. Welcome to the show, Mel Knox.
Well, good to be here. As I started my career selling wine just almost by accident in a store that is near Stanford University, which is now called K&L Wines, huge store. And the guys running the wine department were college friends. And it seemed like a lot more fun than going to law school, which is kind of the default career path for people who can't figure out what they're going to do. One thing led to another, and speaking of Steven Spurrier, I worked for a couple who loved to entertain. And through, I think, Gerald Asher, they must have had Steven to dinner 5 or 6 times. And that was a lot of fun. And I got to know him and then had several lunches with him in Paris. I always felt that the movie kind of did him an injustice because, first of all, he was a very friendly person, not at all snobby, really curious about wine. And the second thing, of course, he was portrayed by somebody who was 60 years old at the time when Stephen was 35. And you think like, geez, get me twice, you know. But the movie is widely regarded as a bit of science fiction here in Napa Valley. But, you know, the real story wouldn't be, probably nobody would go see it, you know, it'd be a little boring, you know. So we got to juice it up a little bit with hot assistant winemakers.
As always in the movie in Hollywood, there's always have to be some more spicing up. And how did you get into selling barrels, wine barrels? What was the transition?
There is a woman named Becky Wasserman, and she was a friend of our customer of the store, a man named Phil Diamond. And she and Phil and a man named Tim Olson, who I also work with, decided to start a wine importing company specialized in Burgundy. Naturally, I became interested in this, and we started selling a lot of their wines. I got to know Becky. Becky was staying with us, and she had the flu. And I said, "Oh, don't." There's nothing worse than when you're on a trip and you get the flu or something. It's just terrible, you know. It's like, so I just said, "I'll help you sell the barrels," and I sold 3 containers. And she kind of looks at me and kind of like, "Well, maybe we should stock here," you know. And so, and then gradually, she got more and more interested in the wine sales side of it, and I was more interested in the barrel side of it. So, agreed to go our separate ways. But anyway, that's what happened. And at the time, well, she was very lucky to be representing two of the best cooperages in France, Terenceau and Francois Frere. And so there we were. And it was kind of a new world then because, people were just learning about barrels. I mean, back then there was very little information about barrels available, academically speaking, and now, of course, you have 3-day long seminars given by the people at the University of Bordeaux or wine magazines or whatever, and you have all sorts of research done on barrels. But back then, we basically, oddly enough, judged barrels by how they tasted. You know, you put the wine in the barrel, you waited 6 months, and some people waited 2 or 3 months. Important thing with barrels, you really need to give a wine 6, 7, 8 months before you judge the results. And so we did a lot of barrel experiments back in the 80s in particular. People tried wine from different forests, made in different ways. All these things were judged. And of course, you still do that, just as a winery in this country, for example, that makes Pinot Noir and Chardonnay in our barrels, that's a big capital expenditure for them. So naturally, they're thinking about if they're getting the right results, they're buying the right product, and so they're under study all the time. And that's, of course, the important thing. People, when they buy a bottle of wine, they think, "Oh, this tastes really good." They don't think, "Oh, I really like the pH on this," or "I really like the way the winemaker added 30% whole clusters," or they don't. They taste it, they like it, they drink it. Maybe they'll buy some more. That's the idea.
Yeah, exactly. And how so that you were saying about the producers, how they experimented. How does a producer can say, I want to produce this style of Chardonnay? How do you go about and choosing, like suggesting them which barrel to go for? How can you give this input?
Well, you have to ask them a bunch of questions, and it's really helpful oftentimes to visit them to see what they're doing. Um, Sometimes people will say, "Okay, I'm going to age the wine for 9 months in barrel, and I'm going to do this, and I want the wine to be ready to be drunk." So I might suggest a certain barrel, a certain percentage. You have to look anyway. You have to look at what they're trying to achieve and make appropriate suggestions. And of course, the one thing about uh, California, let's say compared to Burgundy, is as a French Burgundy barrel salesman said to me, "You have wineries in the Napa Valley that buy more barrels in a year than whole villages buy in Burgundy." And so what this also means is that the winemaker can listen to me and they'll say, "Well, I'll take 10 of that and 10 of that," and then let's say Jim Boswell comes by the next day and he says, "I'll take 10 of that," and Vincent Bouchard comes by, and next thing you know, he's got a 100-barrel experiment, and it's just a drop in the bucket for him. And then he starts making decisions in various ways.
And then you can start choosing which one it works for him for the style that they're aiming to produce, I believe.
We're a country that gives people 42 choices of different kinds of Coca-Cola. And so I suppose the same thing is true with barrels. We give them choices of grain width, toasting, air drying, forest origins, all sorts of things, country of origin. I know some winemakers are really happy that they just say, "Hey, I decided on Francois Frere 20 years ago. I'm not changing, because I'm not changing my mind.
Absolutely. If it works for them,
Because there's so many choices, you could drive yourself crazy. But of course, what's also important is the way the wine is made. I mean, it's funny, I had one winery where one winemaker used to really grind up the fruit. And it was a very tannic wine, almost as though he were making a Bordeaux or Cabernet. And our barrels didn't show too well. Then the next winemaker, and I still joke with him that I should just hire him to go around to wineries, and he had a more gentle approach to the winemaking, and the results with our barrels were terrific. So there are a lot of factors there, and it can be hard for.
to find the right one. So you're talking earlier about the country of origin and oak, the different oaks. Well, where are what types of oaks are they commonly used, and why those one?
There are, of course, two broad categories of oak: red oak and white oak. Red oak leaks, so it's used for construction or fencing, but winemakers tend to want to keep the wine in the barrel. And so we use white oak. And white oak is grown primarily, well, it's grown in the eastern part of the United States, kind of east of the Mississippi River, west of the Atlantic Ocean, kind of north of Florida and the southern states, and south of Canada. And that is a species called Quercus alba, although there are other species. And this is most famously used in bourbon whiskey. The law says that bourbon must be aged in new, freshly charred white oak barrels. This is, of course, a godsend to the people who grow oak. Close to 2 million barrels a year are produced for bourbon. Then those barrels are sold on to people in Scotland, people who make brandy all over the world, Taiwan, all sorts of places. And then the American oak is also used for wine. It has a more obvious flavor, perhaps more astringent flavor than the European oaks. We have oak, of course, is grown in France, and the forests there have been managed 8-9 centuries. In France, their forests are governed by the French Forestry Office. They have auctions every year of sites and so forth, and people bid on the oak. That's good because for every cubic meter of French oak that is cut down in a year, 3 grow. So it's very sustainable. And then oak is also found in the former Yugoslavian countries, Hungary, Austria, parts of the former Soviet Union, and of course the Hungarian. Everybody at the fall, that when the Iron Curtain fell 30 years ago, everybody in the cooperage industry thought about, they got these nice forests back there. And probably 100 years ago, most people thought of a barrel as a container. Barrels were used for fish. They were used, of course, for flour, gunpowder, all kinds of things. Beer was big. And then wine, gradually, you don't see wood beer barrels much anymore, although they're kind of coming back to a certain degree. Nobody ships fish in barrels, to my knowledge, anymore. Somebody's making barrel-aged fish, sardines or something, but could be entertaining. And the barrel business now is pretty much centered on wine and spirits, whether it's cognac, Armagnac, Calvados, bourbon, or wine. And certain wines are aged in barrel, and some, like art, like a Riesling is prized for its fruit. And there's no point in trying to make a Chardonnay out of it. Chardonnay, Pinot Noir are different. Cabernet.
Yeah, it's very difficult. So does every sort of grape have a sort of interact differently to the oak?
I think we have a notion of what Cabernet wines, Bordeaux wines should taste like, Burgundy variety wines should taste like, but we have a wide range of styles when it comes to Rhone varieties, ranging from kind of in-your-face Australian wines to maybe more subtle northern Rhone varieties, and we have a lot of different approaches there. But on the other hand, the varieties from southern France, like Grenache, they're very susceptible to over oaking. They're subject to oxidation sometimes. So it's a more subtle approach with there. But I mean, yes, every variety has its own characteristics. Pinot Noir seems to love oak. It just sucks it up and is happy, you know?
Yeah, sounds like it. He protects it from probably from oxidation. He likes to slowly be oxidized. And I was reading from some of article about barrel making, about the different hair drying and toasting. I still quite it's a mysterious for me what they different, how they work.
Well, it's an interesting story, and of course, when I first started to sell barrels, the coopers didn't have that much money, so usually barrels were air dried 2 winters, and the air drying process was not really properly understood until various research done in the 90s. And the coopers, of course, knew that obviously you needed to dry the wood so that you could make a barrel out of it. So, you had to get the moisture content down to below 20%, around 15, 12%. And this happens in 6, 9, 10 months, depending on where you're drying the wood. And then research done by, notably by a man named Vivas, demonstrated that certain molds and enzymes form on the wood. They neutralize bitter phenolics. They liberate polysaccharides from the wood. And this happens over a period of 18 months. Now, the coopers always understood, and the wineries always understood, that the better seasoned wood made a more subtle barrel, a better barrel, but they didn't understand why. And this is still being studied. If somebody wants a kind of an in-your-face, this has a lot of oak wine, then I would not counsel them to get wood that was aged for a long time. Sometimes we air dry. Another thing that happens during the seasoning process is little kind of micro bubbles, micropores form in the wood. What this means is that every time you fill the barrel, the wine sinks down to another level and gets more flavor. The great thing about longer seasoned wood is you can use the barrel more times. So sometimes you have a barrel that is very expensive to begin with, but you use it more, and in the long run, it's cheaper. You get less astringency from the wood as you air dry it. Sometimes when you have a barrel that's air dried for a short period of time and it's heavily toasted, it kind of tastes like bacon. It smells like bacon or prosciutto,
Okay.
which is not a bad thing if it's prosciutto.
Yeah, exactly. But for the toasting, then it's done after the hair drying. You hair dry and then you toast.
Yeah. So then, what you do? Okay. So what happens to make a barrel? And this probably we could be done in YouTube in 3 minutes. But the tree's cut down. It's cut into maybe what we call bolts, where about a meter. But so you have these mini logs or bolts, we call them, and then the wood is split or sawn into boards that are set out for seasoning. This happens over a period of somewhere between 18 and 36 months. Then the wood is jointed, so if you will, you have a kind of an oblong board that's thicker in the middle, thinner at the ends. And this is kind of the miracle of barrel making, which is probably discovered by shipbuilders 2,000 years ago. You can heat wood and bend it. And so as the wood is heated, it's bent, and the next thing you know, you have the body of a barrel. You put the hoops on, and away you go. And then, of course, you got to fit the heads. Well, now while you're heating the wood, you can heat that wood to bend it in different ways. Some people might use natural gas. It's clean, it comes out of a pipe, everything's wonderful. You could use steam. You could use, there's a cooper in the Beaujolais that uses cauldrons of boiling water. I always think of the Burgundians as the lost tribe of Scotland, very thrifty people. And so they used the wood chips that had left over from milling the wood. So, and then in the mid 70s, Mondavi did an experiment where they said, "Oh, we don't want any toast on the inside of the barrel, or we want it." So the Cooper Demtos used, I think, natural gas or steam to shape the barrel, and they go, "Oh, what's missing?" Well, all of a sudden we discovered that what we ordered you not to do is what we really liked, and so most people nowadays use wood chips, pieces of wood, to toast, to heat the wood during the and the shaping of the barrel. And then people said, well, hey, this is pretty good. So we'll give their customers a choice of different toast levels. And then one cooper said, hey, what I'm going to toast the heads of the barrel because that's, I don't know, 25, 30% of the volume of the surface area. And we thought it was like a communist plot at the time. But one of my customers said, hey, look what it did for his barrels. It'll be really good with your barrels. So we experimented, and people love it. I mean, some people love it. And that's become popular as well.
There's so many options.
Yeah, yeah. And what people think is, oh, the more you toast the barrel, the more toasty it's going to be. Actually, what happens is it kind of becomes sweeter because you've got all those carbohydrates there, if you will. That toast level acts as a buffer between the wine, the alcohol in the wine, and the wood tannin. So maybe it's not as. If you do a very lightly toasted barrel, you really need well seasoned oak because otherwise it can be just very astringent. And of course, how you make the wine is important too. Back in the 70s, people here were kind of terrified of anything, dangerous like malolactic fermentation. People would sterile filter wine into barrel. So then the next thing you know, you have something that tastes like a bad toothpick. Then, when people got into either several things happened. People started barrel fermenting Chardonnay, which is something accepted in parts of the Grave and in Burgundy. I mean, you ferment a white wine in barrel, and then actually a Burgundian technique, which is right after primary sugar fermentation, you put the wine into barrel for malolactic fermentation, became popular with people who made Bordeaux varieties. Sometimes it's a matter of logistics. You got all this wine coming in, all these grapes coming in. You got to do something. So let's put this wine in barrel, and then we can ferment more wine in the tanks we have. And then the people go, hey, this really integrates better. It's much better. So that's a big difference too, is how the wine is made, how the wine is fermented in the beginning.
Absolutely. And what you about the stove? There was like with the remaining parts of the wood. What would they do? Would they turn it to like oak chips or things like that? That they turn.
That's a good question, and we had a cooperage in Oregon, which we sold to our partner. But what we would do is we would mill the wood, and the quality leftovers we would bundle up and save for like 18 months. The bark went to mushroom farmers. The sapwood went to a steel mill nearby, and then with of course, the staves, we made barrels out of Oregon oak, and then after 18 months, we would chip the wood, toast it in an old peanut roaster, and sell that. And of course, that business has become very popular. The whole barrel alternative business. It's cheaper. If you think about it, you replace 500 barrels with a big tank. It's there's a company up in Napa called Safe Harbor, and it was started by guys who were in the chip business. And you can bring a sample of wine to them, and bring them a couple of gallons of wine. And you come back 3 weeks later, and they'll have 12 or 15 bottles of wine with different trials, techniques, and you go, oh, I like this. So the next thing you know, 5 tankers of 6,000 gallons each show up, and they treat the wine. 3 months later, you take it back to the winery, and they're working on million. I will say this: I run into the owner at the supermarket, and I'm driving a cheap electric vehicle, and he has a 4-seater Mercedes convertible. So he could be onto something.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that a lot of producers are considering as the oak chips, but I think there's still the actual oak, the barrels, they still have their beauty and they still have their values for sure, and they're not gonna go away.
No,
And no, absolutely.
I mean, certain. I think obviously you're going to still make great wines in a barrel, but but you're trying to make a wine that sells for $15 or $20. That means if a wine in this country is sold at a retailer for $20 a bottle, that means it's sold to the wholesaler for less than $10. So, and everybody gets their margin. So if you buy a new barrel and use it 3 times, that adds $1 a bottle to the cost of the wine. That's multiplied into $3 at the retail level. You're talking about wines that sell for $40 or $50. Not everybody is drinking $50 bottles of wine every night. So you want to make a wine a nice wine that sells for $15 or $20. You have to economize in certain things.
Absolutely. And as you have been trading for many years on the barrels, there is this talk, then there is a trend going towards larger barrels, for like non-only barriques. Are you seeing that, or do you know maybe if it's more an European thing?
Well, no, I think part of it has to do with not so much with Pinot Noir or Cabernet or Chardonnay, but with Rhone varieties, with Tuscan varieties, with varieties from the Piedmont, varieties from Spain, things like that. Maybe for some of them, a 60-gallon barrel is too much, a barrique. A demi-muid. Demi-muids are popular, but you always have to remember you practically need. They are heavy. Practically need one winery I know practically built a new foundation so they could handle demi-muids. It's you add all that wine, the weight of the barrel, so forth is pretty heavy. But yeah, barrels or larger barrels. Tanks, oak tanks are much more popular. We talk about wine as though everything was traditional, as though we all did the things the way our grandfathers did. But the reality is, though, things are always changing. That happen all the time. Amphora are becoming big, and in large parts of the world, people come to the winery. They want to see something different. So you have amphora, you have oak tanks. You have oak tanks with carved heads. I had a customer up in Oregon who had a picture of him and his wife in front of the winery engraved on the head of one of these ovals he bought, and then they got divorced. He goes out there with a sander. Get that woman out of here,
I mean, I guess especially like wineries, I can imagine how many different styles and experiment they do. They must have seen very different types of oak blend together and all sorts of things.
Yeah, and of course, critics are very important. Robert Parker was probably my best salesman, and for various reasons. One, he liked we had well-seasoned wood, and he liked the smoothness, if you will, and the richness that our barrels gave to wine. But he loved oak, and I also think there's some wine writers you read, and you can't really tell whether they like the wine. Parker was always very enthusiastic about what he liked, and that was contagious. Other wine writers, sometimes they'll like it, but then you kind of, what is this hint of drains and pencil lead and, these obscure fruits and flowers. And you go, now we have wine writers who oftentimes, well, of course, if you're a wine writer, there's nothing to be gained by saying, I still like Chateau Lafite Rothschild. It's pretty good. Oh, and Dom Perignon, that's good too. You have to say, no, I've discovered some obscure guy in a suburb of France who makes fabulous grower bottled champagne, or I've discovered this guy in Bordeaux. I can't believe it's not Lafite, kind of thing. There used to be, you have to, and so now we have people who will say, oh, we want wine to be as pure as possible, as though, they pick bottles from the tree, the vines. Wine is a manufactured product. Let's face it, you ferment it, you age it, you have all kinds of choices. You plant the vines. It is not like the vines are old growth forests. And they can be planted in different ways with different rootstocks, different clones, different varieties, different spacing, different trellising, a lot of choices.
Yeah, there's a lot of choices. I mean, just here in an half an hour talking about the choices for a wine bars, it seems an headache just there to find what you find and what you like. For me, that as an external, it looks incredible, all these choices and everything. I mean, Mel, I think we could talk for hours about these topics, but I just wanted to ask the last question for you, because I was reading about this and I couldn't quite figure it out, and I think you might be the right person to ask. I was reading that oak can also have problem with the TCA. Is that true? How does that work?
Well, that's a good question, and I think that when oak barrels, for example, have a TCA or TBA contamination, we shouldn't blame the tree. Now we have a problem with barrels that when we ship them, we have to be very careful of the containers that they go into. And so we test the containers before they go into the container, because sometimes you never know what was in the container beforehand. But then you can get TCA from the winery. You can, if somebody is, sometimes you could buy wood from a wood broker who does a variety of things. And let's say a guy makes wood for the building trades. He might spray that wood so it doesn't get mildewy or anything. That spray gets over on the staves, you got a problem. There are all sorts of things that can happen. Now, there is a theory that sometimes you kind of like have a bad stave that went bad somewhere along the line that because of the tree. And the problem with this theory is that unless you tested every stave or whatever, it would be difficult to find out. There are different things. Certainly, I'd have to say this, that 25 years ago, in the cooperage industry, we didn't know much about TCA. Now, we do everything in our power to make sure that the customer gets a barrel that is completely sanitary. One of the cooperages I represented, has a control number on every barrel. So a guy says, oh, this barrel's a little funky. I say, give me the number. The next day, I have a 20-page report on the barrel, where the staves come from, how they were treated, when they were tested, all the testing of the container and everything. We're doing everything possible to protect the consumer. We are all human beings. Only God is perfect, and I'm not sure about her, but we're doing our part to make a better world for the winemaker. I understand the cork people got blamed because maybe a winery had a cellar that was a little funky, but it wasn't quite a threshold. Then you add a cork that's not quite a threshold for problems. Bingo, you're over threshold. So then they said, hey, don't look at us completely. And of course, the technical cork, like the diam, has become huge. The problem with TCA is not when it's at 400 parts where you just go, whoa, that's bad. It's when it just diminishes the wine and you say, gee, everybody loves this wine, but it's okay, but kind of boring. Anyway, there is a theory that sometimes you have naturally bad staves. I don't think that's a problem. And indeed, oftentimes I would get a call from a winery saying, gee, this is the first time it's happened with your barrels. When I think, well, it happened with somebody else's barrels. Maybe they got to get in there and do an analysis of the winery. Of course, the wineries, the last 20 years, have spent a lot of money to fix. They've replaced wooden barrel racks with stainless steel barrel racks, not cheap, stuff like that. Everybody's doing their part because we want you, the consumer, to taste the wine the way the winemaker intended, not the way some bug intended.
Absolutely. I mean, I love the part of the traceability there and traced everything, where everything goes. I think it's brilliant. For me, it's like something completely new, and it was super interesting to have this 40 minutes now chat.
We could do it again.
Thank you. I mean, it would be nice. And thank you again for your time.
You take care.
Thank you, Mel.
Likewise, it's been fun.
Thank you. To produce this podcast, I read many wine books, and I get to speak to many of the authors as well. But I do also enjoy reading other books, and I would like to give a shout out to Thoughts from a Page podcast. I have listened to Cindy's interviews with book authors to get inspiration about what to read next, and I'll be sure to use it now that I'm on break. I love her conversation and engaging approach, and I get to listen to the backstories of the book, why an author decided to include the various aspects of her story, personal detail about the books. The podcast is called Thoughts from a Page with Cindy Barnett. Today's guest was Mel Brooke, renowned barrel trader in the USA, and for many years one of the leading importers of French barrels in California. If you're enjoying the podcast and you find it valuable, remember to hit the subscribe or follow at the bottom, and to tell your friends about the podcast. You can find Looking Into Wine on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, and every imaginary listening app. If you're enjoying the podcast, you can donate on mattiascarpazza.com. You can reach us on Instagram on mattia.lookingintowine or Mattia Scarpazza on all the other social medias. Music produced by Samuele Di Nardo, editing and mastering by Tommaso Ascoli.
At FedEx, we're making reusable packaging our priority because Earth is our priority. Our goal is to be carbon neutral by 2040. We call it Priority Earth. FedEx, where now meets next.
Get ready to cheer on Team USA. Sign up for Xfinity Internet and get a Flex 4K streaming box free and Peacock Premium included. Can your internet do that?
Restrictions apply. Not available in all areas. Peacock subscription required.
Xfinity, proud partner of Team USA.